someone had sent in a question. This is from Owen at the University of Waterloo via Ashley. So Owen was asking, which this is definitely related, for students interested in the history and philosophy of science, medicine, and technology, what have you found helpful in investigating psychedelics, i.e., methods, theories, frames of reference, resources, etc.? I'm sorry, I assumed it was the University of
That,
Wisconsin. Okay. Thank you, Ashley.
okay. Uh, that's probably an essay long question or something or answer. I
Hmm.
mean, feel free to email me about that. I know there, I mean, the University of Wisconsin has a wonderful program right now. I think it's the transdisciplinary study of pharmaceuticals and psychedelics. Somebody will, correct me on that, or you can Google those terms, and maybe Ashley's already familiar with that. I know the director of the history of pharmacy there is a former postdoc and a friend of mine. And trying to bring together these different streams, it's really, I think Wisconsin actually has a really interesting program because they've got buy-in from the pharmacists who are often kind of on the front lines of answering a lot of questions that people have, even about substances that are not yet legal. And I think Wisconsin's also got a historical place for doing drug testing analysis. This isn't totally answering the question, but I think there are some real opportunities here for exploring those intersections. And within the history and science of philosophy and technology, or history and philosophy of science and technology, I think those big epistemic questions are often what drives that field, what drives our discipline. Thinking about how do we philosophize this historical event. And to me, psychedelics are just so rich and fertile for those kinds of questions. They're riddled with ethical questions, and even beyond the kind of ethical questions, there are big moral questions that move outside of the frame of, again, like getting your ethics approved to do interviews. But like, is this the right thing to do? Is it the right thing to publish about these ceremonies? Today we're like, yes, we're reconciling and this is good, but there is a reason why for thousands of years, people don't talk about what is sacred. Um, and knowing it does not mean that we should necessarily make that visible now. And so those questions, which are not part of I just did an ethics application, so I'm just down on it right now. That's not part of the conversation in the day-to-day logistics of how do we manage our ethical careers. But maybe that kind of larger question is something, and those are the kinds of things that HTSP, whatever your acronyms are, History and Philosophy of Science and Technology programs can really grapple with. And I think it's one of the reasons why I think psychedelics are really, we need to be interdisciplinary as we think through some of these questions, that this isn't the domain of one field that can solve all the questions for us, because there's just too many implications for what will happen if, the genie's out of the bottle already in some respects. The toothpaste is out of the tube, but now what we make of that, how we move forward in a good way, is going to require a lot of different minds working through these questions. Yeah, Dan. Oh, sorry, Nathan.
Oh, was somebody else about to speak? I'm sorry.
I just had my hand up because I don't know why, but the little hand thing seems to be missing from my screen. So um, can I ask a question now, Nathan? Did you have a
Oh,
question? I can go
absolutely.
first.
Yes.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, it just was fantastic. I just want to thank you, Erika, for that. It's just really stimulating and also just visually magnificent, really beautiful. And you've just shown us all this great diversity, historically, culturally, functionally, medical use, traditional use. What we weren't seeing was maybe some of that authoritarian use. Like we did see that January 6th, right? We all saw that with that QAnon shaman. And I'm just wondering, but I don't know enough about it. I'm wondering, is there a whole place where there's that kind of far right authoritarian use of psychedelics that, because all this great diversity, nevertheless, we might
Yeah.
say it could be under an umbrella of something like creativity and inclusivity. But is there another space, or is that just a couple of incidences? Or might there be another set of images there that we could be looking at?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and I certainly don't want to be like, I don't want to suggest that this is just we should romanticize this past and it's been all good. There are lots of, whether it's QAnon or, well-intentioned therapists, even there have been a whole variety of ways that psychedelics have also been part of projects that I think we would probably find consensus in this room saying like that was bad. And not like we know better today, like it was bad at the time, and it was bad even by conventional standards at the time. And in some ways that is not unique to psychedelics. And yet psychedelics have a kind of public relations issue that I don't think we can afford to ignore that part of the past or part of the current situation as well. I don't think, despite what maybe I'm going to like trash on Netflix here, but despite what we might see in a few examples, I'm sorry, I won't put anybody under the bus here, but like, let's just say Seth Rogen, for example, if he was gonna, no, just kidding. But if you were gonna just follow certain psychonauts, everything is wonderful and great. And I think some of that media attention and high profile kind of celebrity testimonials also overwhelm some of the stories. So you get that kind of hype in combination with these really, really important, but really nasty counterexamples. And those kind of vie for our attention. And, I have a 13-year-old and an 11-year-old, and like, despite my long lectures, they mostly don't listen to me, and they just, they grab onto headlines and TikToks and things, right? Like I have really important things to say, but, it's really hard to compete with that. The way that information gets packaged and I mean, those experiences are real. And they also get a disproportionate amount of attention, I think, in this larger landscape. So I've been kind of playing with this idea. I've just put in a shirt grant for a project that I'm kind of affectionately in my own notes calling like Just Say No, like KNOW. Like we need to kind of turn the script on a prohibition era that caricatures our understanding of drug literacy, like this drug's good, this drug's bad, these people are good, and opens up the kind of uncomfortable nuance and complexity and messiness of the way, there are risks with all sorts of substances and behaviors. But we need to kind of like roll up our sleeves and I think be aware of like, we're not going to be able to control. It's not just a matter of like, you have to do a political test before you're allowed to take psychedelics, or we suspend your driver's license when you take MDMA or something. Like, I don't think some of those regulations are going to help to mitigate the issues that they're going to happen if psychedelics continue to be greenlit in the way that they are, regardless of Health Canada's approval. I mean, with the kind of cultural approval of I don't know how many people tried to watch the Mike Tyson fight, but I didn't really care, but I was curious after his after his psychedelic experiences, if that was going to make him a good fighter, but it turned out Netflix should crash. So, so my aforementioned 13-year-old son. Sorry.
No, it's a great answer. And it's just that it's very complicated. I think there's just a lot of us who are in some way in this field now. There's this, we're excited about it. And there's this kind of these assumptions that these plant medicines lead to something like universalist values. And I'm just not sure that that's true. I'd like it to be true. But yeah, it's obviously a lot more complicated than that. So, but thank you for your answer. It was, nuanced.
I'll just say one more thing on that. I think there's a real temptation, and I get it. I have this temptation too, to like, we lived in this kind of prohibition that we see the holes in that prohibition. Like it was so phony in so many ways that there's a temptation just to like flip the script, like move past that and say, no, it's not that bad. But that would be, not really learning from that prohibition era and recognizing that like, yeah, there's some bad stuff and there's some good stuff. And how do we manage that? How do we, invest in education programs so that we have nuanced harm reduction, informed language? What are we going to put on the label? Not recommended to drive for 8 to 12 hours, or like, don't take a philosophy class right now. You should really like stay away. Like what you could imagine the different ways that we might give warnings about what to do under these conditions. And I think we're so far from having any kind of consensus or comfort. We've gotten used to these kind of soundbited ways of interpreting that information that I think it's not very exciting, but like tune in, turn on, slow down, or read more. I don't know, like it's not as exciting.
Thank
Oh,
you.
sorry, one more thing. Has anybody read Blitzed? You come across this book? It got a lot of attention. It's a German journalist who wrote about methamphetamines and the Nazis. And he's written a new book. It's in German. It's been translated to French. As far as I know, it's not in English yet, but it's coming. So brace yourself. He claims that the Nazis were also taking LSD. And if that book has as much attention as his previous book, Blitzed, I think this is going to hit the psychedelic community in a really hard way, but in an important way. Now, it seems that according to my colleagues who are working in the Sandoz archives and read German, there's not a lot of evidence in this book, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to get a ton of attention and is going to fit into preconceived ideas about the direction that psychedelics are going in anyway. So I don't actually know what the title is or what it will be in English, but watch for it, because I think, it's stories like that, and it only takes a few that start to change and create these kind of an ideological cleavage in how to manage some of these, big, important kind of PR structures that will have a huge impact on how we talk about these things in more nuanced ways, and the nuance will disappear. Sorry, that was a really long answer, but thank you for that. Blitzed is kind of interesting, but sorry, I see.
Olga.
I think you're muted.
Oh, here we go. Hold on. I don't want you to see my dirty dishes. My question is kind of related to that last comment. How do I, as a scholar, be able to manage this tension between what is accessible for information, whether right or wrong or fake or redone, amidst also the scholarship that is redirecting and reconfiguring, rereading, going back to the past, kind of reevaluating what are the stories, what did we miss, what didn't we look at? Like, it's such a dynamic movement that, to Anne's point, doesn't necessarily guarantee that if you access the transcendental space through whatever you want to call them, entheogens or psychedelics or hallucinogenics, and let's make a list of all of the different names that they've been called, that it's going to guarantee sort of this evolution to a better place. I don't know. Like, that's, it's an interesting thing to consider, the tension of these different moving parts, and how do we affect maybe more, maybe not evolution, but maybe more of a intellectual awakening or something, or discernment, right? Because that's part of my own experience in academia, is how to acquire critical thinking and analysis, so that when I am uptaking, I have some questions to say, really, is that true? I don't know. And I can't go back and experience it. So it's just, maybe it's more of a comment than a question, but it offers these really diverse, interesting conversations.
Yeah, I think, I see this on display in different conference settings as well. And, psychedelics are wonderful because you go to a psychedelic meeting and, you can't even assume that everyone will be wearing shoes. Like, you get people from a whole variety of walks of life. Thank you for, that wasn't meant to be an offensive comment, so thank you for your laughs. But I mean, I can be talking to a pharmacologist and an artist, and, there are people who are new agers and old agers. Like, there's a whole variety of kind of minds who come together in that. And that's, I'm being a bit romanticizing here, it's a bit idyllic. But it's interesting because, I work on history of science, history of medicine, and that's not always the case. And so I think as a humanities trained person, I'm very used to going to places where, like, the answer, my thesis is, it's complicated. It's messy. There's no consensus. We need to think about like everything. And then you go and you talk to Health Canada and they're like, what should we do? And you're like, oh, well, you see, it's complicated. And then the Zoom call ends and you don't get invited back. So this tension between like trying to find ways of communicating in ways that are driving towards consensus, and our orientation as scholars in other ways of like avoiding consensus, like to say, oh, it's really simple. Like I'll lose my job. They'll take away my PhD. Like that's just not how history works, right? Or how humanities works. But I think that's actually, we're in a generative moment. And, if we fast forward to whatever appropriate time in the future, hopefully they'll think back and say, no, despite all of the examples around us, and I think there was an election recently, like there may be some historians in the future who are like, these are dark days. But there also might be some positives, or this might be a generative moment where we like step back and say, like, wait a second, like, what do we trust? How do we organize and prioritize different forms of, I'll say evidence again, but information? I mean, whether it's, we can see this on display in a variety of ways with whether it's social media or like vaccines were a good example of, where did people find the bit that they would grab onto to trust? And I think, psychedelics are in a similar moment. We have an opportunity to think about like, let's kind of crack this thing open and think about not, should MDMA be approved for couples therapy? Maybe, but I don't think that's the point. I think it's like, how are we going to agree that we're going to put this evidence on the table when we make decisions? And we have an opportunity to play with that a little bit more. Also, because no one's watching, like we're getting our funds cut, so we might as well. Sorry, you're muted again. Sorry, Olga, I'm sure you had a witty response, but I couldn't hear it.
I always have comments. I talk to myself a lot. I live alone. I talk to my animals. I'm just agreeing with you. And so I speak out loud to myself. Zoom's watching. We're recording this right now. It is now accessible in the future by all, forever memorialized. As long as the cloud exists, we exist. Here we are. We've already uploaded our consciousness.
Uh-oh. Sorry, Bridget, I think you had a question as well.
Hi, thanks so much. I was really intrigued. I'm very interested in the first person experience in psychedelic training and sort of the idea of self-experimentation and, some parameters for people to take records and have it, to improve citizen scientists. So I'm intrigued for the 1952 guidebook, if that's available somewhere. And then just sort of more broadly, if you've had research on sort of this idea of what sort of parameters somebody might follow for recording their self-experimentations.
That's a great question. I recently teamed up with Erowid and the Erowid Vaults take a step back for a second. I'm kind of like intrigued by this question of like, what is psychedelic harm reduction? And those first person accounts are really rich for thinking about how have people learned to take care of themselves and others. And it's, again, it doesn't necessarily fit into that consensus model or like a pamphlet or a guide that even some of those early guides. The 1952 one is a lot of notes and a lot of accounts and then kind of interspersed. I don't think it was meant to be circulated. They weren't polishing it up. But there's another one in 59, and I'm in the process of trying to work with that one to annotate it and then publish it as a kind of, here's how they were thinking about it in the past. So I've been thinking about this a little bit. And what's interesting is they're definitely trying to take a bunch of accounts and then find some synthesis that, like people are aware of the acoustics in the room and music is really important. And, things that we might almost find laughable now, like, of course, or like make sure that, the lights aren't too bright. Make sure that, you don't have a washroom that you have to walk down a hall to get to past other people. Again, some of these are maybe just really obvious, but, these guys are voyageurs in this particular moment. And it's not, I think it's in part when they go to that ceremony that they're like, oh, there's some people who've been thinking about this for a lot longer. We should just like take a beat literally, and, listen to them. And then that correspondence begins to change and they start to engage with that. So there are all these different seams of influence that come into the picture. Arrowwood's done an incredible job of collecting those first-person accounts. And what we're hoping to do in the project we've just pitched that if any of you are Shirk reviewers, watch for it. We've applied to interview people who go to music festivals as, Zendo Project or Cosmic Minds, or people who are providing care. And so far our anecdotal research, which doesn't count for much, but it's my preliminary research enough to try to write a grant, is that there are a lot of people with experience who attend music festivals. Again, hope you're sitting down for that. Some of them have taken psychedelic drugs, or all of them. So experience really matters also in moving that project forward. Not my project, but in moving this idea forward about how to learn how to care. And that in the 1950s is this real kind of division point between the introduction of randomized controlled trials, which really picks up after thalidomide in the early 1960s. You must not know, you must not have experience. We have to sever that kind of way of knowing from how we investigate evidence to the opposite. And it may be, in addition to embracing complexity, that those experiences become part of what we have to reconnect with as an epistemology, as we think about how do we evaluate evidence. Actually experience might be beneficial, as opposed to something that we only talk to each other in the hallways about because no one can admit it. You're giving your presentation and you can't admit that you've tried these substances, but in the hallways people are talking about. Anyway, that might be another piece that I suspect 50, 75, 100 years from now, they're experience is going to matter more as a way of anchoring evidence. And we already see it outside of the academy. Mike Tyson died when he smoked the venom of the bufo toad, and this is going to make him a better person or something. Those testimonials are really vying for our attention, and that's all about experience. And yet it really conflicts with the way that we're organizing evidence to give advice about who should take this or under what conditions. And that just seems why would we trust that? And I'm so pro public health, but the way that we're accumulating evidence or sifting through it seems to be at odds with how people encounter these things on their own. So yeah, my anecdotal experience is, I went to Dana Larson's shop a few weeks ago in Vancouver. He's, legally selling psychedelics in Vancouver, although his store was raided recently. And I'm like, so what do you think of the clinical trials? What is Health Canada saying? He's like, what? I don't know. People take these things, and I tell them about my experiences. He collects people's experiences. He has pamphlets where people can write in and add stuff. He's like, no. People are taking these things anyway. I can't wait for Health Canada. So things are going to move whether or not the regulations, and often I think our academic orientation or the way that we're supposed to function as academics ties us to something that removes experience. Yeah. Although in our conversation,
I think about my medical training, the idea that I would be taking a substance, absolutely not, right? So it's a change for sure.
If I'm remembering correctly, you have experience with palliative care work, and this is another area that those questions, those kind of moral and ethical questions, come up in really sharp relief with, is it okay in these circumstances to start thinking about applications in different ways? And yeah.
Thank you so much.
Or Nathan.
I just saw Arsha's hand earlier, so I just wanted to make sure that Arsha got a chance. But if your question passed Arsha, then Olga, then
I was keeping an eye out on the stream, and there were some questions, but you touched on some of them, so they took the question back. But I'm keeping an eye out on the stream, so if anything comes, I'll pitch in.
Thank you, Arsha.
No problem.
Olga?
I didn't have a question per se, but just to say, I'm throughout my 30 years of being in the both spaces really, through sort of altered states consciousness, learning about Stan Grof's work, and then really diving deep into the Brat Pack that I call. There's this really interesting relationship between palliative care and psychedelics, especially in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And so there's always been, you know, those who are kind of seen as the grandmother and grandfather of, you know, community-led end-of-life care, not only Dame Cecile Saunders and Belford Mont within the clinical, but also, you know, Ram Dass and Joan Halifax. But they were in the other world too. And so I love this relationship. That's the one that I'm really interested in. And part of, again, bridging that true interdisciplinary lens, you know, looking through the clinical, looking through the history, looking through the psychology, and bridging that is just fascinating. That's where my brain just starts to fire and get really excited about this work into the future. So not just a question, but thank you for the affirmation of where things might be leading, because I worry, you know, why am I doing this? Like dedicating my life force energy. And I'm one of those folks who is you know, a trained psychedelic sitter, therapist, you know, nurse, and background in end of life care and those kinds of things. And so it's just, I appreciate the affirmation to keep going and not to wait, maybe. I know that's not really what you're intending to say, but, you know, also the space of maybe utilizing cannabis. And I know that I've had this conversation, I think you as part of education, you know, and the amount of folks that are actually using like FICO and high doses of cannabis oil to save their life, who have gone through remission, right? And the same kind of conversation. This is not a panacea. It really depends on the client and all of those different dynamics in relationship to what constitutes health and well-being for them. But there's these similar stories between those two areas. It's just really interesting how it blends together. But I would love to, you know, I can't, it's sad that I can't read Czech, because I would love to go into the old archives of Stan's and be able to read, you know, these nuanced letters of, hey, take a little rye bread before you go, kind of a thing. That would be really interesting.
There's a journalist based in Victoria, Ross Crockford. His name is not Czech, but he's fluent in Czech, and he was a journalist in Prague for 10 or 12 years. And he spent quite a bit of time going through now Prague archives. There was this Cold War thing, and you know, there's some concerns about what was kept and what wasn't. So not to say that therefore he has all the answers, but he's done quite a bit of work on that, on the Czech story. And one of those articles is published in our book, Expanding Mindscapes, and it's just one element. He's looking at Sadska Clinic in that particular one, where Grof did work, although the particular article is not about Grof per se. But he's somebody to keep on your radar if you're interested.
What's his name, Erika? Can you somebody put it in the chat for me? Or because I do speak Czech, I just can't read it very well. I am fluent in Czech. I was born there. This is what I am a dual citizen. So my international scholarship could bring me back home to take care of my parents while they're dying and slip them a little something. Thanks. This is very exciting for me in this way, and seeing the weaving, right? Seeing the weaving and saying, is this really important? Like, should we be looking at this? But can make good story.
It's interesting. I think like the Czech story, which I only know from the work of people like Ross Crockford, is fascinating because they also go through like a pretty pivotal political change. And even, you know, how you talk about that political change depended on who you were, and doctors were somewhat kept out of, you know, Prague Spring and stuff to some extent. But even, you know, things like Alcoholics Anonymous was banned there because you couldn't have anonymity. You know, there couldn't be these kind of brotherhood societies or fraternal societies. So there's some really interesting parallels in terms of the time frame, but also really big differences in the Czech story, that they start producing their own LSD because Sandoz was no longer, you know, sending it across the Iron Curtain. And the Czech physicians, as I understand it, and psychiatrists, and even some of the sexologists who got involved from the clinic there, were really fascinated by this, but severed from that. So they start creating their own ways of doing things. And I have letters from, I've seen in the archives letters from Stan Groff writing to the folks in Saskatchewan to try to get articles sent to him prior to when he then moved
And he
to
left.
Baltimore. So there's
That's
a
amazing.
fascinating
My
additional set
thesis
of
will
stories
now
there.
be cooking in Prague, the history
Awesome.
of making of LSD.
There you go. I love it.
I have to do it after my parents die, or otherwise they will die.
Don't let them read Blitzed. Sorry, Asha.
Yeah, so I just want to say great talk. I really enjoyed it. And we have a question in from Sheldamar, who also said excellent presentation and he enjoyed it. And he's asking if you can share any names of organizations, initiatives, or communities that are doing work that needs to be amplified.
That could be a long list. I mean, probably. I guess I would wonder what the amplification is. Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that question, to be honest, because I mean, I think there's a lot of really good work going on, but yeah, it's interesting to try to imagine, where does that go to, or like how I'm interested in making connections, maybe more than amplifications, and maybe I'm misinterpreting the question there, but yeah, the relationship that I've been developing with some of the folks from the Native American church community have been so precious to me. And I feel like I'm starting all over again in learning a different way of organizing my thoughts and thinking through some of these questions that that's an example of a situation where I'm like, I don't think it needs to be amplified yet, but I'm really curious to continue, exploring some of these connections to see when to amplify, or when it should be on, I don't know, YouTube, or again, I'll pick Netflix for example, but and not to denigrate the question, I just maybe don't understand it exactly.
Well, I guess a good extension to that would be, who do you think is doing the work that most aligns with your opinion of how we should be moving forward? I mean, for me, I can think of maps that I don't necessarily think that they're doing the work that they should be doing. Not in the sense that we don't have to be pushing for MDMA to get, legalized, but in the sense that they're not doing it in the most optimized way, in my opinion. That whole rejection of the MDMA and how they designed their experimental, design wasn't the best, and it felt very rushed. It sort of just, it seems to me that they weren't thinking about
Yeah.
the best way to do the research, but rather they just wanted to listen to FDA and just check their marks to push it. And my personal opinion is that we might not be ready if this is how we're
Yeah.
doing it.
That's a much more specific angle on this. I'm really curious about and forgive me for like being a historian, but it is what I was trained to do, so I'm gonna just cling to it for a moment. But I'm really curious, and I do find myself musing about this as I drive to hockey games for my son or something, in really important, productive moments, like 3 o'clock in the morning when I wake up and I can't sleep. Let's do my best thinking then. Is how will this time be remembered? And like, will MAPS be the organization that is remembered, or maybe it's Symposia, or it's Shakruna, or it's, the Ottawa Psychedelically Speaking group. I mean, there are a bunch of different players in this space, and some of them are moving through rather rapidly, and some of them have more staying power. Some of them have more resources. And it's going to be interesting to see kind of where things shake down, because in some respects, it seems that there is an uncomfortable and perhaps necessary relationship between having like an agenda, like getting MDMA across the FDA finish line, for example, and funding and philanthropy. And it's an uncomfortable, and again, like maybe a required relationship. Maybe it's hard for philanthropists to say, you know what, we think you have good ideas. Just take the time you need. think about it. It's complex. You'll need that. That's hard to get people to invest in. But if you have a targeted goal, it's easier to get that funding. And in order to maintain that funding, you have to stay in the spotlight. So I tend to agree with you. I think, I kind of had this like strange moment watching those FDA decision hearings, and I'm like, I'm kind of not totally upset, or I'm not, I think it's okay. It felt a bit rushed. I was like, this isn't the end. This should be the beginning. This should be kind of like a cautionary moment where we're like, okay, we're not ready. What do we need to do to get ready? Or whatever that might mean. But I guess sort of like examining some of these relationships, those fraught relationships, the way that, the only way to get money to keep Rick Doblin flying around the world, I guess, is one thing. And then there's another answer to this that is sort of circling around in my head. And forgive me, I played soccer most of my life until I ruptured my Achilles. I played soccer and I coached soccer. And I think, if I want my soccer team to be successful, if I want to be Man City, like I don't want a whole team of Rick Doblins, but I definitely want one. Like I need someone who can hit the back of the net, but I also need people who can like run lines and keep the ball out of the net. And I need to have this I need to have depth and diversity on my team in order to be successful. And if I imagine that as a way of orienting a psychedelic movement, so to speak, you probably need a few of those narcissists at the front who are going to take risks and shots when I think that's risky. I've always been a defender myself, but we need and this is where I think we continue to sort of lean into the need for diversity, that without a Rick Doblin figure, maybe the conversation wouldn't be quite where it is. So there's some, important there. There's some that's important. But it can't just be concentrated into single individuals or characters or organizations. And again, there's a lesson here from the past. I don't totally agree with this interpretation of the past, but I mean, there is a sense that like everything was going fine. And then Timothy Leary came along and he like peed in the soup and, he ruined it for everybody. And like, if only that guy hadn't have been so reckless, like it would have been fine. Now, I think that's a gross oversimplification. He is not to blame. And he actually was like, Humphrey Osmond thought he was really square when they first met. Like he was very bookish and like buttoned down. He had his shoes on, that kind of thing. So I think there's a risk in sort of collapsing this history, but also the future in the faith that we might have or the, revulsion we might feel towards a particular individual or particular idea. Because I think it really runs the risk of oversimplifying again. And then, that has all sorts of different domino effects. Does that even come close to answering your question?
100%. That was very insightful.
Okay. I don't know if Man City's winning these days, but they won a lot of games, so.
Well, I want to be mindful of time because this has been great. I'm glad we, are doing what we aim to do and generating conversation. I mean, I will see, does anybody else have any okay. Yeah. Heather?
Yeah, totally. So thank you so much for this, Erika. So you've mentioned actually public health a couple of times in this chat. And in terms of like, how can public health sort of step into this space? And apart from adopting your say no to psychedelics campaign and promoting that, how can sort of public health step into the space in order for, and especially at this pivotal moment, I think like post-pandemic where, trust in public institutions is at an all-time low, God forbid, should we continue getting lower down? Like, where is, I guess, if you could click your heels and be like, hey, this is what I'd like to see from a leadership perspective in public health, what would it look like?
Oh, awesome question. During the pandemic, I don't know if he's my friend anymore, it'll become apparent why. My friend, colleague said, this is going to be a big deal. We should probably be like historians of the present and go out and like measure things and capture experiences and stuff. And that's why we shouldn't be friends anymore. Because I was like, that's a bad person to have around when you have children you're homeschooling. He was too, though. And one of the organizations we partnered with. We had, I think, 63 organizations who identified as kind of on the front lines of some element of public health. Now that includes, Saskatoon Fire Agency, as well as the Food Bank and Prairie Harm Reduction, or our Only Needle Exchange. So this kind of like big tent again picture of like, how are you actually managing the health needs and health crisis? And that was like, well, there's a housing crisis and there's a food crisis and all of that. And it became really clear in those many, many, many hours of interviews and things that, things are stretched, and there's also a really competitive model with a lot of agencies within public health that are, trying to find breadcrumbs, except during the pandemic for a few moments when they had core funding and they worked together. And it was actually kind of like, they're like, don't tell anybody, but like there were some real positives, not positive like COVID and, meth overdoses, but positives like they weren't competing with each other for breadcrumbs of funding, and they were able to make some planning, even though it was not long-term, it was still in a crisis situation. But the way they talked about their capacity to change their decision-making structure was really important. So it strikes me that, we could take some lessons from that. And where psychedelics fit into this is we could not, despite my many efforts, talk about psychedelics. It was like, sorry, we are like trying to keep, sorry, my kids just got home. We are trying to keep so many balls in the fire that our Prairie Harm Reduction just said, like, there's no psychedelic harm reduction. We don't deal with that. We're only dealing with, this is what harm reduction looks like. And this is, all hands on deck and people burning out, trying to meet the absolutely desperate needs at the time. So they're just, it's been interesting though. Okay. So paragraph break. Last Friday, I was in a federal jail. I was asked to give a talk to parole officers about psychedelics. And I was like, oh joy, what's this going to be? But it was around Indigenous healing. And I was there with members of the Native American Church as well. And part of what they were saying is that like, we are out of ideas. And this sounded much more like my COVID project. We are out of ideas. We need to work across lines. We need to think differently. We have people who are just cycling through. They're not even bad people. These are parole officers telling us this. This is not sustainable, what we're dealing with here in terms of, their words, addicts and like the gaps, the gulfs in the public health system in terms of like finding the kind of support and in this case, healing ceremonies. I know this will sound ridiculous, but like, I think some core funding would be really helpful if I was queen of the world or, guru of the planet, like some core funding so that, people are able to do their jobs instead of have to fight for a way to be off the side of their desks while managing frontline services in other ways. And to be able, I'm from Saskatchewan. That doesn't mean I like ventriloquize Tommy Douglas all the time, but like sometimes, but preventative care is like ultimately cheaper than emergency care. And somehow we've really gotten away from that with this idea that, everything can just be pushed through the emergency room doors. And it again, just kind of pushes people through one portal that doesn't actually manage the needs. And I think this is probably true wherever you all are, but food prices and inflation have created problems that are so deeply public health related, and yet we seem just unable to meet those needs. And we keep finding like, again, we go back to those same agencies and they're like, well, there's a budget over here and we're on this budget line and we can't talk to each other and we got to do this. And you guys apply for the fund this time and next time we'll go for food. Like, that's ridiculous. Sorry if that is not much of an answer.
Thanks for that.
Yeah.
Thanks, Heather. Well, yeah, I think we're nearing. I also know your kids just got home, so I want to respect that. I do have a quick, more trivial, like a come down question, if you will, since we've gotten pretty deep here. But I don't want to take the last question if anybody has anything else. So I'll open the floor for a second. Okay. I was just wondering, kind of nerding out about this. My research is on trip reports, so I got very excited about the Arrowwood thing. I'm going to basically be climbing down into the vaults and throwing away the key, I think. But I was just wondering, you mentioned meeting Anne Shulgin, and obviously Sasha and Anne Shulgin are a big kind of like influence on the experience report genre, I would say. But anyways, that's irrelevant. The question was just if there was anything cool about meeting her, if there was anything notable, or if it was just
It was so cool to meet her. Well, so many things are cool, but I will pick one for now, and then next time we'll talk about other ones. She gifted me a piece, a San Pedro cutting from her garden, and then like expertly wrapped it up and explained. And I was like, but I have to cross a border and it's COVID and they're going to check my luggage. And she's like, oh dear, here's what you're going to say. And it was just the sweetest, like, you don't say no to Anne Shulgin. And you know, it's San Pedro and it's still alive. I've managed to keep it alive in the Saskatchewan climate, obviously indoors. But that was just a cherished moment, and it was absolutely sweet how she just, you know, she's like, and this is how you're going to care for it, and this is, you know, we need to keep the plants alive. And so that was just such a sweet gesture. And then I've tried to take a page from her gesture forward and have either a piece of plant or something that I can bring to people, even if it's not a San Pedro plant or one with psychoactive properties. But it served me well. So I take that lesson from her and I pass it on to you as something that is really kind of sweet. She was 91 first time I met her. So just to place that in context.
No, that's awesome though. That's a very cool tidbit. So thank you so much. This was an amazing first event. Thank you to all of you for asking such great questions and for being involved. And, you know, stay tuned. We'll be sending out more updates soon. If you're interested in submitting anything for the graduate student conference, the call will be out within the week. So thank you all again. We will call it here, and I'm sure I'll see most of you soon. Thank you again, Erika.